Hi everyone, this is Andrew Primer, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, this is week 144 of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this is the first week of December 2024. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about the new Ukrainian weapon, long range long range drone rocket Hell, how Ukraine successfully used it on Russians, and we're going to go through updates from the front lines. So, Ukraine showed Russia its new rocket drone called Hell and used it successfully in the recent weeks. A missile attack was carried out on Kursk and Kurchatov, reported Russian media sources. In Kursk, sirens were turned on for hours, explosions and air defense work was heard, and residents reported powerful blasts all over the place. Kurchatov is a satellite city of the Kursk region in the Russian Federation where the Kursk nuclear power plant is located. And I think that this is not just a strike on Kurchatov. This is a severe warning to Russians that if they strike Ukraine nuclear power plants, then the nuclear power plants will be also attacked with new long range weapons. That's the consequences of such a war when they strike at infrastructure can be unpredictable for both sides in the modern realities of the present time. In the Kursk region itself, there is a military airfield in Khalina where Russian fighter jets were previously based. Now, the airport is used only for the short and temporary landings due to constant airstrikes by Ukrainian forces. That is, the Russian jets, and in limited, by the way, numbers, fly there for one or two combat operations and go back. If the Russian aviation regiment were stationed here, it would already been under Ukrainian long range or drone attacks. Returning to how Ukraine is expanding the range of weapons that we use for attacks on the aggressor country, it was recently announced that Ukraine officially presented a long range weapon called Hell, which has already been used to strike the enemy, and it had passed all the tests, and even the President Zelensky solemnly handed over the first batch of these latest drone missiles with a range of 700 kilometers to the armed forces of Ukraine. The advantage of such a drone missile is first, high speed. It will overcome the zone of attack of the enemy anti aircraft missile system faster. It will not linger there for hours in the zone, for example, the defeat of S 300 complex, or more than 10 minutes in the zone of the defeat of Russian medium range complexes, such as Buk, Tor, and other similar weapons. It will quickly, it will quickly, literally in seconds, cross the zone of defeat along the chord and fly on its mission. A range of 700 kilometers is precisely what we need now to destroy a number of Russian military bases. We're talking about at least 20 airfields of Russian aviation that is constantly bombing Ukrainian cities. Military enterprises are also in this zone and are quite important for the Russian defense industry. For example, the Smolensk plant, where the Kh 59 missiles are still produced, is actually within this range. There are also enterprises, the defense enterprises, that make not the final type of weapons, but components that are extremely necessary for development of many types of weapons. Now it will be possible to deliver massive strikes against those facilities. Well, let's take a last week example. The strike on Kurchatov near the Kursk. If the Russians try to continue striking our nuclear plants, now they will clearly see that we will be able to launch up to 100 such missiles back at their facilities. What will happen to the Russian Kursk nuclear plant? They're striking our nuclear plants and we're striking back to their nuclear plants. The Russians must know that there will be a response to each of their strikes. There will be no one sided game anymore, like it was back 2022 when Ukraine didn't have such a long range weapons. The enemy will indeed prepare for such strikes, but this preparation will take a lot of resources that the enemy could use to prepare strikes against Ukraine. We will have to prepare reserve positions. We will have to disperse some of our resources. This will distract personnel and engineering units from storming our positions. The Allies must also see that we are not helpless, and our population must see that it is not only Russian rockets flying in our direction, but Ukrainian rockets will fly to Russia. So let's talk about latest developments at the front last week. So here's the weekly review. During the 2024 Donbass offensive campaigns, Moscow began each offensive by trying to go straight to the target, often knocking out the Ukrainian brigade they had targeted. However, after covering a few kilometers, the advance to the initial objective was disrupted by the arrival of Ukrainian reinforcements. The march from Avdiivka to the gates of Pokrovsk initially threatened to cut it off from Konstantinivka on the northern flank. The advance, blocked by the arrival of fresh Ukrainian reinforcements, shifted, slowly breaking through the Vovchansk line and rolling back. People began to worry about the fall of Pokrovsk, but soon the Russian advance was stopped everywhere except on the southern flank, north of Kurachiv Reservoir. It was at this point that the situation around Vuhledar deteriorated, and Ukraine was forced to retreat to the current Kurachiv-Velika Novosirivka line. Now that the defense around Kurakhova have been strengthened, the Russians are advancing toward Velika Novoselka, further west and south of Pokrovsk city. Ukrainian reinforcements are now being transferred there, and it seems doubtful that Moscow can continue to indefinitely shift the fighting westward in an attempt to turn the Ukrainian group's flank. Ukraine will continue to defend itself stubbornly on most fronts, accumulating reserves for a major counteroffensive in 2025. It could begin as early as spring, but I expect the period from June to October will be very decisive. While much can go wrong, if all goes well, we should expect a rapid movement that will radically change the situation at the front line. By the way, this week, the General Sirski publicly confirmed that a counteroffensive is indeed planned, and we will talk about that more and all the possible options. It is interesting to see that battle hardened leaders begin to take on leadership roles. The latest step is promoting Mikhailo Drapati, apparently responsible for orchestrating Moscow's defeat of the Kharkiv offensive this spring. Ukraine's military reset is ongoing and mainly moving in the right direction. However, the lack of large scale shipments of American armored vehicles suggests that the Biden administration approval of limited use of short range ballistic and cruise missiles on Russian territory was a smokescreen. The Biden team appears to be deliberately sabotaging Ukraine's ability to launch a major counteroffensive in 2025, which is why Ukraine could not sit idly by until 2024 and play defense, as the Americans wanted. If Ukraine had not entered the Kursk region, forcing Putin to escalate, drawing, drawing North Korea into the war, most likely the Biden team would probably never have proven with its limited ATACMS authorization that the fear of escalation that justified the lack of full support for Ukraine earlier was always a lie. Okay, here's updates from the Eastern Front. Last week, the front's main part again passed through Donbass' southern edge, although the long advance to Konstantinivka through Chasiv Yar and Toretsk began to bear fruit for Moscow after huge losses. The Kurakhova-Velika Novoselka front remains under heavy pressure, but reinforcements are arriving to stabilize the line. The biggest question on this front now is whether Velika Novoselka can be held. The city itself doesn't represent an excellent defensive position. It doesn't have high reinforced concrete structures, but it is located at the confluence of the Mokry Yala River and two of its tributaries, which should complicate the Russians' maneuvers. In addition, the city is located at the base of a ridge that rises 50 meters above the plain, a difficult obstacle in the steppe terrain with strong observation potential. Therefore, Russian attacks west of the city on the other side of the Mokry River are cause for concern. Although for now, the Ukrainian force seems to have simply retreated to, to their main line of defense. The loss of Velika Novoselka will not be a fatal defeat, as it seems likely that the Ukrainian forces will be able to establish containment lines to the west and the north that should hold. But it's a useful node in the logical network of the area. So if the price is not too high, it's worth considering giving a group of Russians a bloody massacre while the deteriorating weather allows. In many places, Russia increasingly relies on direct infantry attacks without the use of armor, often using motorcycles and golf carts to minimize the time of impact. As a result, the number of casualties has exceeded 2,000 per day for the first time ever. Heavy vehicles are increasingly being reserved for priority fronts, where they are also being lost in record numbers. The long awaited metabolic crisis is gradually intensifying, although it will take most of 2025 to significantly undermine Putin's machine. Pokrovsk remains the main Russian objective, but almost all of their progress in this area is concentrated south of the city, and they are slowly advancing towards Shevchenko. Chasiv Yar is largely a repeat of Toretsk. Here, the Russian forces have managed to expand their northern bridgehead across the canal, but are reportedly having great difficulty building up enough troops to push further through the defenses. So, here's the Northern Front updates. There is a constant local fighting on the Kharkiv front, but neither side is making this area is a priority. But weather might allow a local attack, which may be unexpected and achieve some success. But at the same time, it is difficult to rebuild it into a long term operation. On the other hand, intensive attacks on Ukrainian positions continue in Kursk of Russian Federation. Very little success have been recorded over the past week, although the Russians are trying increasingly hard to break through the western part of the occupied Kursk region to reach the village of Sverdlenkovo. Russians continue to fight their way across the Snagot River through Daryne, trying to break into a sector that is reportedly covered by 36th Marine Brigade and 103rd Territorial Brigade, with the 21st Mechanized and 82nd Air Assault Brigade determining the flanks. So, the 47th Mechanized and 17th Heavy Tank Brigades appear to be fighting around Novovanivka, while the 95th Assault is repelling attacks on the northern arch of the occupied Kursk zone. So, but for those who like to argue that Ukraine is sending its best troops to the Kursk region, neglecting other sectors, just keep in mind that Kursk is just one of at least half a dozen separate battles of similar scale. Together, they consume twice as many men and 5 to 10 times as many armored vehicles and artillery as Moscow can muster. So, Southern Front, short one. Fighting continues along the Dnipro River and the Zaporizhia front, especially near the area where Ukraine won in 2023 south of Oryhov. There is talk of a Russian offensive in Zaporizhia, but the reserves needed for such dangerous actions as taking Orekhova or Goliapol seem to be lacking. So, airstrikes and other developments. This week has been as tense as it has been on the front lines, with both sides launching drones and Moscow launching a number of missiles. There have been no other attacks since one hit an S 400 air defense system in the Kursk region of Russian Federation about a week ago. It is to be hoped that this and other strikes using high end weapons were not limited to one off actions to send a message in classic Biden style fashion. Instead, Ukraine has sent a few drones into Russian airspace to strike oil depots. They're probably better targets than refineries because they disrupt the flow of oil to the front rather than abroad, where the Russian oil feeds factories in India that produce 155 mm shells for Ukraine. It is worth noting that next year Ukraine plans to introduce 1,000 long-range attack drones, another nail in Putin's coffin. Putin, of course, is again striking at Ukraine's energy infrastructure. In addition to the usual drone strikes, a major cruise missile strike has been added, with the Black Sea Fleet has finally joined in, launching calibers from a small bastion near Novorossiysk. It remains to be hoped that the six Mirage 2000 fighter jets that Ukraine is about to receive and the Scalp cruise missiles that can be targeted in flight will be able to get close enough to do some damage next year to the enemy. This time, F 16 shot down seven cruise missiles, and Moscow has not yet been able to destroy any of them. Ukraine should receive a small squadron by the end of this month as well. If the Swedish AWACS aircraft, which are due to go to Ukraine as well, are put into operation by the end of the spring, the situation in the air war will change dramatically. Networking technologies are good because connecting data from the airborne radars to the Patriot battery increases the effective range of the latter. And if someone gives Ukraine long range air to air missiles for F 16 jets, Ukraine can also get in on the game. Also, a few Gripens wouldn't hurt either. So the war in Ukraine can definitely change its course after the new US president comes into power in about 6 weeks. Anything is possible. The latest development in the world tell us that the future is highly unpredictable. As you remember last week in Georgia, riots again against the pro-Russian government continue to escalate, making Putin gang weak. In Syria, rebels launched an enlightening offensive last week against the current Putin supported government, and Assad fall escaping to Russia, making Putin weak again. In South Korea, the opposition has forced Yoon Suk Yeol to declare martial law for the first time in 50 years. In Germany, a government crisis has erupted, with Berlin set for early elections in February already, following the collapse of its center left coalition government. In France, another government crisis looms with the French government non confidence vote set for Wednesday. So you see, the world is being reshaped and will never look like it did even 3 years ago. All of these events also divert attention away from the war in Ukraine, reducing it to just another conflict that the West is not in a hurry to resolve. But still, what Donald Trump will do in about 6 7 weeks is not clear until he comes into the power and at the end of January. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, share with your friends.